Tidewater, Greater Virginia. Well, we're just going to talk about Tidewater, not the Upland South. There's no Upland South at this point. Uh, the region I was talking about, last time when we left, we had been talking about the Middle Atlantic area, right? This area right here. And today we're going to talk about just this one area that's referred to as the Virginia Tidewater. And that is the area that includes both the Chesapeake Bay. It also includes Albemarle Sound right here, which is being covered up by the legend, and Pamlico Sound right here. So Pamlico, Albemarle, and Tidewater, and the rivers that are tributary to those estuaries. An estuary is in this case, people refer to it as a bay, which it is. Chesapeake Bay is certainly a bay, but during the Ice Age, when the ocean levels were lower, these were actually valleys of sort of the lowland river valleys of the Susquehanna River and a few others. Now, when sea levels rose, after the glaciers, the continental glaciers receded and melted, seawater, the ocean level rose, and it's still rising a little bit. Then what happened was those valleys, those lowland river valleys, actually deltas, right? They were river deltas. Those were flooded. So those are very shallow bays for the most part. But because they're flooded, they have created a situation similar to what we saw in the Bay of Fundy, but not as extreme. So that whenever you have high tide, salt water, for the most part, pushes up the rivers a bit. And then when you have lower tide, the fresh water kind of works its way toward the bay. And that back and forth between high tide and low tide takes place twice a day. And the tides aren't extreme, of course, but that back and forth creates a situation where you have salt water mixing with fresh water all the time. So the term is brackish. It's a brackish water area. It's a pretty unique environment and very productive in terms of seafood, productive in terms of fish and shellfish. And if you ever visit, of course, Maryland, the state food, state food of Oklahoma is what? Chicken fried steak or catfish, fried catfish, something like that. In Maryland, it's soft-shell crab, right? Everybody ever had soft-shell crab? All right, so it's kind of a special thing. So anyway, that's so the Chesapeake Bay is important for fishing, but early on it wasn't. That wasn't the attraction. The attraction was the land. And the reason I'm spending as much time on the brackish tidal estuary sort of thing is that's where the name comes from. First of all, it's a tidewater area, and also the rivers. You'll notice that the rivers are actually fairly wide as they get pretty far inland here, both in North Carolina and in Virginia and Maryland. And because those are old river valleys and fairly deep, it allows ocean-going ships to go fairly far, pretty far up into those estuaries. So, in other words, this is a very intricate. It's a lot more intricate than this map, of course. There are islands. There are all sorts of necks of the estuary, and the advantage that had was that the plantations were established along transportation lines by water. Okay, this is an important facet, really, of the tidewater geography. It's a lot like Louisiana in that settlement is very much associated with access to the outside world, access by water to the outside world. And so this is an area that has a lot of, it's not a very large area, but it has a lot of connection by water early on in the 17th century that allows those plantations to, the plantations being so close to water transport are not, they don't necessarily have to do what we call wholesaling, right? So there's a unique geography to the Tidewater in the 17th century, in that agriculture doesn't have to be collected to sort of a middle collection point before it's shipped off to its market. And the reason is because of those estuaries and the tidal connections. Plantations, rather than having to move things through a wholesaling point, simply worked directly with England. So the plantations had direct connections. Now, that's very different from what we would find up here, say, around southeast Pennsylvania. Remember, we talked about the excellent farmland of this part of Pennsylvania, actually this whole area right here. This is fantastic farmland, but everything that is all of the produce, all of the grain and livestock and that sort of thing that produced in southeast Pennsylvania, best poor man's country, as James Lemon referred to it. Everything had to be carted, taken, carried to a market somewhere, where it was usually processed and stored and then distributed to an urban market. So that's very different. And in southeast Pennsylvania, then, that very good farmland, that would be one of the impetuses for the development of good roads. By the end of the course, we'll be talking about the transportation development, the road transportation within southeast Pennsylvania, New England to some degree. But southeast Pennsylvania is the place where you begin to see the first private development of roads, and also some government directed development of transportation lines as well. But not in the Tidewater. In the Tidewater, you don't have to have, there's not a real need for roads. There's not really, even if you had roads, the necks of the Chesapeake Bay and of the estuaries would cause those roads to have to divert crazily. So it's very much a natural transportation friendly place. And everything is, for the most part, moving by ship between plantation and the mother country. So very, very different geography there. And that plays out to be very, very important, because unlike southeast Pennsylvania, which would develop what we call a central place system of towns, farm to market towns, and eventually cities like Lancaster, Pennsylvania over here, which would be sort of tributary to the surrounding farmland. Farmers are moving overland to bring their goods to market. And because there's a collection point, things like the processing of grain makes sense. And the manufacturing of more valuable goods from raw materials and from agricultural products. But in the Tidewater, you would not have that development of an urban system, a hierarchy of places between that would, for the most part, focus development around the city. And that means that the Tidewater would remain fairly rural, a very rural area, a place without cities, for the most part. Okay, so let's move on a little bit. And again, the cultural areas that we're talking about, this is for the most part, this purple area is the area we're focusing on today. Next time we'll talk a little bit about Carolina down here. But the Tidewater, in terms of its culture, compared to the other areas of English settlement, particularly compared to New England, is fairly secular. Right? This is an area where the most of the settlers came in pursuit of wealth, or perhaps leaving a debtor's prison in London and basically to get a new start. So the place is not a family-oriented settlement zone at all. And in fact, that would be one of its problems. One of its issues would be that the population didn't grow very quickly because there was really no natural increase taking place. There weren't a lot of women coming to Virginia. And without a rapid population increase, then there was always a need for labor. And you know how I've said that in colonial America, the problem was never with land. There was always plenty of land and plenty of natural resources. The problem was always with capital, having cash, but even more so with labor. Labor was always dear in the frontier areas of the United States, of North America. And without having cheap labor, without access to cheap labor, then things would develop rather slowly, and that would be a real hindrance to population growth and expansion of agriculture. The groups that arrived in are generally referred to as the West Countrymen, the people from southern England, particularly southwestern England. They are the ones who populated this area more than any other group from England. Up here in the Puritan zone of New England, we have most people from East Anglia, the area of sort of east and north of London, east coast of England. Very different folks for the most part. Here we have Puritans, very much associated with Cromwell and supporting the Parliament and parliamentarians. And during the English Civil Wars, this is an area that is dominated by the Cavaliers and the Loyalists, the folks who were part of the aristocracy who were loyal to the king. And so that would be another facet of variation between the Tidewater and the Carolinas and the Puritans up here. So, you know, we understand today that, you know, the Southerners are really different from the New Englanders, right? Today. But they've always been different. They've always been different, right? And they started off different. They started off with different purposes of settlement and coming from different areas, having different religious backgrounds, and just very, very different, even though they're all English, right? For the most part, early on. So you have an aristocracy, you have a demand for labor. So the very first way that they attempted to replace the demand, or at least satisfy the needs for labor, was to bring in indentured servants, indentured servitude. But of course that costs money. Transporting people across the Atlantic isn't cheap. It costs a lot of money. So how do you do that? So that's what we'll talk a little bit about today. And the agriculture, of course, was focused after about 1614, 1619 on producing tobacco. That was the cash crop that eventually clicked. It was the, not the olives, not the wine, not the pomegranate trees, all of these things that they tried. Not even the silkworm, not even the silk trade would work, but tobacco would. Tobacco was fantastic because it brought a high price, it was addictive, people in Europe started smoking, and there was money to be made. Now, even if you could find enough labor, you still had to get some land. And in this part of the frontier, the colonial American frontier, land became a commodity. It was not something that was out of reach for most people, but it was definitely a commodity because tobacco production had a real drain on the fertility of the soil. Number one, tobacco is a row crop, like corn is a row crop. And this area is not, it's not completely flat. It's actually kind of rolling once you get out of the real, tidewater areas. And there's enough slope to produce erosion. So a row crop has to be weeded. So you want to make sure that there's a lot of cultivation that's going on all the time. And like cotton or corn, tobacco being a row crop had to be weeded and cultivated constantly. And any slope that you had and any rainfall that you had was going to have some damage on the soil through erosion. But tobacco is especially hard on the fertility of the soil. And so, especially prior to 1800, farmers really didn't have a lot of technology. They didn't rotate crops very much. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson was one of the first planters to really experiment with crop rotations in an attempt to replenish nitrogen and humus in the soil that the tobacco was very hard on. And so the tobacco business required, for the most part, opening up new lands and having some land to clear, because you knew that you were eventually going to have to shift your operations to better soils. So in a sense, this is nothing new. Agriculture kind of, certainly slash and burn agriculture still does this. The soils are played out after so many years. You have to move your fields to other areas and let the place go fallow. That's especially true with tobacco. All right, so now for some of my ugly slides. In the 17th century South, we have really, if we look across this area of North America, the southern areas are actually being developed, but not all by the English at first. Florida, as you know, is still Spanish, and Texas in the early 1600s is having some very, very sparse settlement and sort of at least exploration by missionaries and that sort of thing. But Florida was certainly being colonized half-heartedly by the Spaniards. Now, we're not going to talk so much about them yet, but keep in mind that the French would also show up in South Louisiana in the early 18th century. So we're not too far away from that. But the two that are most important here is in the 1600s, in the early 1600s, the Chesapeake, and we're going to talk mainly about Virginia and Maryland today. And when we look at the economy of Virginia and Maryland after about 1700, or at least toward the end of the 17th century, in the late 1600s, the economy of both Virginia and Maryland had, for the most part, revolved and emerged around tobacco production. Maryland and Virginia were both very much tobacco colonies. Made a lot of money for England. But they didn't make as much money as the sugar islands in the Caribbean. The British sugar islands, in particular Barbados. Barbados is one of the Windward Islands that's way out in the Atlantic. It's the farthest, I think, of any of the large major islands out in the Atlantic. It's made out of limestone. It's a very different island. It's not volcanic like most of the other ones, but it's been shoved up, and so it has this limestone bedrock. And it's not a very big island at all, but the soils on Barbados were very good early on. They attracted English and later Irish sugar plantation owners. It was one of the very early colonization zones for the English, after like Bermuda and the attempts to get people into the Tidewater area. But this is the area that we'll talk about next time with Carolina is kind of an offshoot of the Barbadian Caribbean sugar colony. And so sugar is a very, very important commodity, and really Barbados was making more money for the English than any other colony at this time. So the key is to focus on sugar production and tobacco production. And I'm just trying to tell you that both of these are for the most part new commodities. They're fairly addictive commodities, right? I think I could say I'm definitely addicted to sugar, and it's one of those things I'm fighting all my life. But sugar is something that was an expensive drug. It was an expensive commodity that people were willing to pay a lot of money for, at least people in Europe that had money. So very important luxury crops, typical plantation crops. Tobacco is not a tropical crop. It is definitely a subtropical, for the most part, subtropical crop. Sugar is subtropical, tropical. All right, move on. Well, we talked a little bit about the native peoples already and the Tidewater and the groups that the English on the James River, Jamestown, were dealing with were the Powhatans. The Powhatans had, generally the people throughout this area of Virginia and Maryland had been reduced quite a bit by disease. They had already had some contact with Europeans early on. They wiped out some Europeans that had attempted to colonize the Chesapeake, but apparently they had been decimated by smallpox and probably other diseases. So they were in a situation of flux. Remember, I talked about the middle colonies having been really weakened. The native peoples in Pennsylvania in particular had been weakened and had already moved out when William Penn's colony was established in the 1680s. And it wasn't as extreme down here in Virginia, but it was sort of the same thing. So you had a reduction of cultural complexity. You have a merger of tribes, and the Powhatan Indians had formed a confederacy of a lot of smaller groups. So you have that dynamic of native peoples kind of coming together and forming new societies, or at least sort of merged societies. We don't know much about at all. So, but we do know that they had been scrambled and then brought back together in an attempt to maybe place a check on the expansion of Europeans. The farther back into the backcountry, we would have in the groups that would become known as the Creek, who themselves were a confederacy of diverse peoples, and the Cherokees, who had absorbed groups from other places up north. So the Cherokees and the Creeks were the more powerful tribes in the Piedmont area of the Carolinas and Georgia, and they were also at this time up here in the Blue Ridge area of Virginia. So the Cherokees were actually a force to be reckoned with in the backcountry of Virginia. Okay, we have a map here that is indicating the boundaries of some of these areas that were established, and these are forming. They're not set in stone necessarily, but early on, Virginia was just this relatively small area given over to the Virginia Company of London. And Massachusetts Bay, or the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was this area located by the Virginia Company of Plymouth. And I mentioned that, in between, there was this kind of zone that the Dutch and the Swedes moved in on, because it was kind of the buffer zone between those two overlapping claims. we would see over time Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania would be including both what is today Delaware, which would later lose, and then Maryland. So Maryland and Pennsylvania and Delaware and New Jersey all had these conflicting claims early on. Carolina would become two colonies quite a bit later in the 18th century. So at this point, we're just talking about one colony known as Carolina that spans all the way from Albemarle Sound right here, all the way down to, basically to St. Augustine, but not realistically. So the English are claiming this whole southern area as Carolina. Carolina. That term would stick, you know. North Carolina and South Carolina would be divided later. Okay, let's see. I've talked a little bit about Richard Hakluyt. Remember him? Richard Hakluyt was a geographer who was putting ideas into the head of these British monarchs. There's actually several Hakluyts. And Hakluyt is responsible for some of the kooky ideas, what we kind of see today as kooky ideas about trying to start, you know, a silk production business in Virginia, or growing wine grapes, or producing olive oil, or citrus fruit. Remember that? So, but that's basically a learning experience, right? We all have learning experiences, and the English had the learning experience of that. By the way, I always say English until we get to the year, what, 1704? Is it 1704 or 1714? When the Union is established, and it's Great Britain after that. So in the 18th century, I'll refer to Great Britain. But here we're talking about the English. So tobacco is really successful, and that's what begins to draw settlement. And then we have this emergence of an Indian frontier, which I believe I discussed a little bit last time. But you know, the English in Virginia were, they, number one, in the first decade or two of Virginia settlement, mortality was incredibly high, and mostly because of disease and not necessarily Indian raids. But as the population grew by the 1620s and 1630s, that's when the native peoples began to really realize something's wrong here. They just keep coming. And these people are growing in larger numbers. So we have a number of skirmishes and wars. Powhatan in 1622 destroys, for the most part, what the English have. But then the English, of course, the English have been dealing with rebellious people for centuries, and they unleashed retaliation on them. And so the Indians would continue to attack. In 1644, 500 Englishmen killed by a surprise attack, but the English turned around and brought in troops and then established blockhouses, which were these essentially like places to hold boundaries and to prevent the movement of native peoples into the areas colonized by the English. But this is where we begin to see that term Indian country, a division between Indian country and what the English would refer to as their land, their civilization. The economic stuff here. So a couple of things. Getting land was, in Virginia, something that you had to have some connections with, for the most part. So we have the development of what we might call a bifurcated society early on. And I'm not talking about white and slaves. I'm talking about upper class and servant class. That's the first establishment within the Tidewater, and would continue to be until the 1690s, when the first slaves were brought in. So you have early on a planter class of aristocratic families generally of these Virginia company investors, and these are the minority. Then you have the servant class, people who are mostly landless, some of whom are actually indentured servants, a lot of them who are brought over for labor. So I've already mentioned that tobacco was hard on the land, and it encouraged agriculture to extend up the river necks and to try their best to bring in labor. One way that worked, one approach or one solution to this was to use something called a headright system. Okay? A headright was an incentive for the landowning class, planter class. It was an incentive for the planter class to spend capital on transporting labor into the region. So for every head of every laborer that you brought in, you got to claim an extra 50 acres. So it was a subsidy, in a sense, the subsidy of the Virginia company and later the Crown to allow landowners to get more land, to claim more land by transporting and paying for the transportation of those workers, indentured servants most of the time. All right, now I'll talk a little bit about the English Civil Wars and the middle part of the 17th century, but we have to keep in mind that this is an area where there's a very different perspective on the English Civil War down here in Virginia as compared to up in Massachusetts. The indentured servants, the landless men, tended to be sort of, I want to say loyal, I guess I didn't say loyal, they tend to be loyal to the planters. And what that means is that these are people who are striving to become planters. These are the folks who don't own land, but they know that if they get to the New World, someday they might. Someday they might work their way up to becoming a landowner themselves. And this is very important because the bifurcated society is not really divided. You have a lower class group of men who have their loyalties toward these aristocratic families, and they admire them for the most part. So they admire them, and they realize that in the long run they might reach that status. Okay? So in the New World we have not so much a conscious effort here to transplant a feudal society, but we have the remains of an old English feudal society. And because of the type of agriculture that gets started, plantation production, shipping directly back to England, no merchant class really, there is a survival of this old chivalrous relationship between the lower classes and the upper classes. The upper classes, are, they are, they're not necessarily disrespectful of the lower classes. The lower classes are definitely respectful of the upper classes at this point. So this is an area that has, because of the social group, mostly in terms of religion, they're Anglican, they're Church of England people. Paternalism, the idea that men are leading the families, and of course there really weren't a lot of women yet, so it's very much materialistic and chivalrous somewhat society. All right, well that was not the best explanation. Sorry. Anyway, the plantations are what we want to focus on a little bit here. We think of a plantation, perhaps we have stereotypical imagery of plantations in our minds, but what you should know is that the plantations were relatively small and they were working landscapes. They were not manicured lawns and that sort of thing. They were like any other working landscape. They were messy, all right? Plantations, even though they're called plantations, were not, terra from Gone with the Wind. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about land that's being utilized to make money. It's a working, it's like, like somebody's workshop, or like my office. It's junky and messy, but it's a workspace, all right? So these plantations were working landscapes. They had those direct connections back to England, and I think maybe one of the first days of class I mentioned this term, hogshead. A hogshead. Remember what that was? A hogshead was a unit of measure. It was very, very similar to what we call, what we have today on container ships. You've seen these big containers coming into places, into ports like Long Beach or Savannah or someplace, and these ships that move all of the stuff that's manufactured in China, going to Walmart, for the most part packed in these gargantuan shipping containers today. And they just stack them like Legos on the ship and move them very, very quickly, very, 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 very efficiently. Well, the hogsheads are kind of like that, except they're just big barrels. And it was a unit of measure because if you pack that with tobacco, then that's what was determining the your shipment. You had so many hogsheads. So a hogshead were these giant barrels that had kind of an axis through the middle of them, and or an axle, and so they would pull them to the port facility, usually by oxen or something like that. So that's an important facet of this. And you would seal it up, and then it would be shipped directly to England. Shipping container of the 17th century. So the thing about the plantations in the Tidewater area is that they were not only shipping things directly to England through hogsheads and didn't have the need for wholesaling middleman centers. The plantations themselves were places that had some specialization. So if you were a rural farmer in Virginia, not producing huge surpluses of tobacco, and so you needed some blacksmith work done, you didn't go to a town to do it. You went to the plantation. The plantation provided all those services for the most part. If you were sick, if you had some illness where you needed some doctoring, then you went to a plantation nearby because the plantation probably had someone who was skilled in medical care of some sort. So the plantations were, for the most part themselves, actually self-sufficient. They produced a lot of food. They cut a lot of trees for lumber. They were doing lots of different things, but of course, like any plantation activity, any plantation operation, they were focused on producing that cash crop. The cash crop demanded food crops, demanded a lot of other things, it demanded labor, trees to be cleared, and that sort of thing. Okay, so this is the idea of a plantation is sort of a self-sufficient production operation that did not require a wholesaling function. All right, so move on here. This is one of my favorite maps of this region. This is by Don Meinig, and out of his first volume of the Shaping of America series. And the one reason I really like this map is because you can see that prior to, this is about, I guess, 1650 or so, this zone right here along the James River, here's Jamestown right there, and it took them quite a long time to colonize just the Tidewater area, which is this area where you have, it's defined by the reach of salt water up to a point. And that point is defined as the fall line. The fall line is where you have, on the rivers, typically some cascades, not necessarily waterfalls, but there's a little bit of an escarpment there. And so this area right along this line is the boundary between the reach of salt water and, for the most part, the stoppage of movement upriver, because you can't get ships or boats beyond those cascades. Now, some places the cascades are kind of big and scenic, but generally what's going on here is that if you're going to build a town, it would make sense to build a town here. That way there would be a transportation portage, or whatever you want to call it, a portage around the Cascades of the river. And so the towns, not just in the Tidewater area, but all the way down into the Carolinas and Georgia, would develop as what we call fall line towns. Towns developing along the fall line. Richmond, Virginia is one example. Petersburg, Virginia is another one here. And you can see a few other examples all the way up, toward Philadelphia, which is a fall line city as well. Now, remember I mentioned Lancaster, Pennsylvania? Lancaster up here is one of the early towns in southeast Pennsylvania. But note that the fall line is also, to a degree, a boundary between two regions. One region that utilizes water for the most part to get around. So if you're going to travel from, let's say, somewhere up here on the Rappahannock River, so you have a plantation right here, and you want to go over to here, okay? You're not going to cross this way. You're going to get in a boat, and you're going to go by water. But if you're on the other side of the fall line, there is no water transportation. So you have to go by road. And each one of those roads are going to be crossing rivers. So guess what? You have the development of towns at river crossings. So by land, by sea. And the river crossings, for the most part, would be the fords in the river, the natural low areas in the river. And so we get place names that end in ford, as an example. But the most important geographic feature here that would, for the most part, attract urban development would be the fall line cities. Falmouth is another example here. Baltimore later on. Baltimore is very close to where the fall line is very close to Chesapeake Bay. So it's a very good location. And one reason I mentioned Lancaster was because there would be later on settlers in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia on the other side of the Blue Ridge Mountain, as well as just in the Piedmont area of Virginia, up here in northern Virginia. They would not market their goods necessarily at places like Alexandria or the port cities. They would simply take their stuff by good road to Lancaster. So there's a lot of interaction between the Northeast and the Southwest, not as much interaction this way. So in a lot of ways, you have the lowland Tidewater region is kind of developing as its own culture. It would have its own accents for the most part. And the regions in the Piedmont, and particularly on the other side of the Blue Ridge, would be very much connected more to the area of southeast Pennsylvania and even Philadelphia than they would the planters down here. This is just kind of a zoomed in view of the areas settled during the 17th century. So everything that you see in the purple here, which would include the area around Albemarle Sound, was settled in the 1600s. And that's really the focus, our focus at this point. Just to give you a quick little impromptu quiz, if you were to go up through here in the 1660s, what sort of people would you run into? You got to know what area, what's the estuary called? Delaware Bay, Delaware River. 1650s. This is New Sweden, remember that? You're looking at southern New Jersey, but this is the area where the Swedes and the Finns were establishing themselves. I'll talk more about them when we get into the upland south. Okay, again, to review a headwrite, a device used in Virginia and Maryland to attract labor, to attract settlers. And you would get, each settler would then also be, the plantation owner had this incentive to pay for the transportation. He would get the 50 acres. The settlers would also be promised when, if they were indentured servants, that they would have the rights to 50 acres after their indentured servitude period was up. But of course, a lot of indentured servants came to Virginia and they didn't necessarily go through their entire sentence, right? So it was difficult to keep indentured servants around because they would just go into the backcountry. They would leave and establish their farms elsewhere. So anyway, the headright was a way to get people into the region. Now, by 1700, at the end of the 17th century, you have a developing Tidewater culture that was hierarchical. That is, had stratified social groups. There were the wealthy blue blood families, and then there were a lot more people who were of the lower classes, the poor whites, who had come as laborers at some point, and maybe the descendants of indentured servants. In terms of religion, it was not very religious at all and Anglican. And because of the lack of urban development, it stayed very rural. So people were more local. They referred, the most important political division within the area was the parish or the county. So it was very small scale political geography. And I've already mentioned some of this stuff. Like these are often the sons of the English nobility. Oftentimes the second sons of the English nobility who didn't receive any inheritance because they were the second or third sons. And rather than inheriting an estate in England, they were given the opportunity to establish their own estates in Virginia. There really weren't very many African slaves in the early part of the settlement period of the 17th century. They would begin to be brought in the 1680s in larger numbers as, guess what? The indentured servants, the supply of free white laborers declined. And why did the supply of free white laborers decline? Anybody? Any reason? What's going on in England in the 1680s? Well, the war is over. The English Civil Wars are over, right? Things kind of get settled. 1688, you have the Glorious Revolution. And after the 1680s, and during the 1680s, the economy in England begins to settle down and becomes more stable. And so there are more opportunities in England. And there are more opportunities in Ireland as well. So Northern Ireland. So the economy improves in England, and with the economy improving, fewer people are willing to go to Virginia and risk dying. So the free labor supply kind of dwindles by the 1680s. And that's when you begin to see the shift from free labor to slave labor. And remember, slavery had been going on for well over a century and a half in the Caribbean, sugar islands of the Spanish and the French, okay, and the Portuguese down in Brazil. So it was a fairly easy transition to say, okay, well, we're producing tobacco, but we need more labor. So they started paying for African slave imports. Now keep this in mind. Why didn't they use slaves in the very beginning? Why did they lose lots of labor and pay for the transportation of labor of free laborers? Even though indentured servants were not so reliable because they would venture off and not work for you anymore. Well, the answer, and this is surprising to a lot of people, but slave labor is probably the most expensive form of labor that you could possibly have, because slaves cost money. They cost a lot of money to purchase because they're being transported. And then they are also dependent. They're a dependent population. So they have to be fed, they have to be clothed, they have to be sheltered. Everything all of their needs have to be met by the planter. So it's plantation, we assume slavery works with plantations, but only those planters who were making large enough profits could ever afford to invest in slaves. And that's why early on, you have the development of the plantation economy under free labor, and then the ones who are really getting large and very successful are the only ones who can begin to invest in the most expensive form of labor. And I don't want to make this antiseptic or anything, morally antiseptic, but it's very similar to, say, the automobile industry. Okay, let's take an example like that. Back in the 70s and the 80s, Nissan and Toyota and Honda started really taking over the United States automobile market, right? And then in the last 20 years or so, what are some new automobile manufacturers that have really come on strong lately? Tesla. Okay. Well, not actually thinking that, but yeah, okay. For the regular consumer. Hyundai, Kia, so Korean-made cars, right? Okay, so I'm just trying to give you an analogy. Why are Hyundais and Kias able to undercut Hondas and Toyotas? Is it because they use cheaper labor? Not so much. It's because they're newer factories, and those newer factories use robotics and newer technologies that tend to be cheaper. So what I'm trying to say is the newer operations are often much more efficient and more profitable, but the problem is it takes a huge investment, okay? Huge investment in robotics and that sort of thing. So the transfer from free labor to slaves was something that really only the very richest folk, the very richest planters could afford. But guess what? The lower classes aspired to become slave owners. They realized that if they could, so much land, and eventually they might be able to get slaves. If they get slaves, then it's pretty much open to you. Are we past time? I'm not watching. Right on time? Woo! Good. All right.